Now, the White House has confirmed it inadvertently added a U.S. journalist to a private group chat discussing classified plans to bomb Yemen. Now, it's an extraordinary breach of security with America's entire national security team in the group, including the vice president. The journalist, Jeffrey Goldberg, was informed of the strikes 2 hours before they took place, a little over a week ago. Well, Sarah Smith is live in Washington with the very latest. Sarah, Jeffrey Goldberg, he is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine, and he's written at length about what beggars belief, being put in this secret chat group with the highest level authorities when it comes to America's national security.
I know, it's stunning, isn't it, that a messaging app like Signal could be used to talk about military plans, and absolutely shocking that a journalist could accidentally be added to this group of top national security officials.
What's happening, friends? Dr. John here. So let's get started. Trump appears to have caught Vance leaking internal information and responded with swift, targeted public humiliation, a message aimed not just at Vance, but at everyone watching. Trump doesn't share power, doesn't groom successors, and doesn't tolerate ambition that even hints at threat. Vance's positioning as heir apparent just became his greatest liability. Donald Trump has effectively elevated Marco Rubio at the direct expense of JD Vance, creating a visible contrast between the two men that leaves no ambiguity about who currently stands in favor and who has been cast into the outer darkness.
Of his own personal and political ambitions, telling Vanity Fair last week, if JD Vance runs for president, he's going to be our nominee, and I'll be one of the first people to support him. Very rarely do you see in Washington politics somebody who does something like this.
Yeah, really remarkable, kind of the setting aside of personal ambition. And arguably, these two men, JD Vance and Marco Rubio, would probably be among the top contenders.
This is happening at precisely the moment when the political world has begun speculating about the future of the Republican Party, asking the question that everyone in Washington whispers but few articulate publicly. Who is going to emerge from this fractured movement as the next potential presidential nominee? The contest between Rubio and Vance has been brewing beneath the surface for months, but Trump's latest move has transformed what was once subtle maneuvering into open warfare.
Vice President JD Vance must have been experiencing whiplash today between multiple reports about whether or not he'd be going to Pakistan tomorrow for a second round of Iran talks. In a phone call today with our very own Jackie Alamany, Trump said that Vance would not be participating in these talks, citing security. Instead, he said U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner would lead the negotiations. But less than an hour later, two senior U.S. officials told MS Now that Vance will in fact, lead the delegation to Islamabad.
Let me be perfectly candid from the outset about my perspective on both of these individuals. In my opinion, both Marco Rubio and JD Vance are treasonous traitors and genuinely vile individuals whose records of public service represent a stain on the institutions they have occupied. That assessment frames my analysis, but the events I am about to describe stand on their own regardless of how one feels about the characters involved. What matters is the power struggle itself, because the outcome of this internal conflict will shape the direction of American politics for years to come. The most dramatic manifestation of this rift arrived in the form of a diplomatic assignment that speaks volumes about who is rising and who is falling in Trump's estimation. Marco Rubio has been formally dispatched to the Vatican for a high-profile solo mission, and the significance of JD Vance being explicitly excluded from this trip cannot be overstated. Our friend Christopher Hale, writing at Letters from Leo, was the first to break this story, and his reporting captures the brutal symbolism of what Trump has orchestrated. In what constitutes a major diplomatic humiliation, Donald Trump has effectively given the middle finger to JD Vance, the highest-ranking Catholic in the entire federal government. Trump announced that Marco Rubio will be traveling to the Vatican alone, and Vance has been explicitly barred from participating in the meeting with Pope Leo XIV, scheduled for this Thursday. The Vice President of the United States, the man whose Catholic faith has been a central component of his public identity, is being told to stay home while the Secretary of State takes the meeting that should have been his by any conventional measure of protocol and precedence. The context surrounding this decision makes the snub even more pointed. Within the MAGA movement, a consensus has been forming that Rubio's star is ascending while Vance's is in freefall. The traditional metrics of influence and access within the Trump orbit are all pointing in the same direction. Rubio is being given the high-profile assignments and the visible displays of presidential confidence. Vance is being sidelined, excluded, and treated as an afterthought. The chatter among movement loyalists has grown increasingly blunt. Vance, they say, continues to humiliate Donald Trump through his actions and his associations, though the reality is that Trump requires no assistance in the project of self-humiliation. The man is perfectly capable of damaging his own standing without any help from his vice president. Hale's article lays out the specifics of this extraordinary situation with clinical precision. Donald Trump is sending Rubio to meet with Pope Leo XIV on Thursday, and Rubio will be the sole representative of the administration at this audience. JD Vance will remain in Washington, isolated and irrelevant, deliberately excluded from the administration's first cabinet-level audience with the Pope since Donald Trump publicly ruptured relations with the Vatican over the Iran war. The symbolism of this decision is multi-layered and devastating. Vance is the highest-ranking Catholic in the federal government, a man whose religious identity has been central to his political narrative since he first entered public life. He flew to Rome in the previous year alongside Rubio to embrace the new American Pope, a moment that was captured in imagery designed to establish Vance's credentials as the administration's primary interlocutor with the Catholic Church. But that moment has been overwritten by a new reality, in which Vance is not even permitted to attend the meeting, let alone lead it. The history of Vance's interactions with Pope Leo XIV adds another layer of humiliation to the current situation. There exists a famous scene from the previous year when Vance personally asked Pope Leo XIV to appear at America's 250th anniversary celebration scheduled for July. The request was made with the full weight of the vice presidency behind it, and the Pope's response was a masterclass in diplomatic deflection. Pope Leo XIV informed Vance that he would be in Lampedusa during the celebrations, that he would be in Italy fulfilling his pastoral obligations, and that he appreciated the invitation but would not be altering his plans. The Pope effectively snubbed JD Vance, and now Donald Trump has ensured that Vance will not even have the opportunity to attempt a recovery of that relationship. The cumulative effect of these events is the emergence of a visible and apparently widening rift within the White House power structure. Vance is being pushed to the margins while Rubio is being positioned as the administration's primary figure on the world stage. The irony of Rubio's elevation is not lost on anyone who has been paying attention to his recent activities. While Donald Trump's naval blockade of Iran continues to deteriorate into failure, while Iran persistently rejects what Trump characterizes as negotiations, but what objective observers recognize as ultimatums dressed in diplomatic language, Marco Rubio was observed in Florida this past weekend performing as a wedding DJ. The Secretary of State of the United States, the nation's chief diplomat during a period of mounting international crisis, was spinning records at a wedding reception. This is the man Trump has chosen to elevate above his own vice president, the man being groomed for greater things while the administration's foreign policy apparatus crumbles around him. The origins of this dramatic shift in Trump's favor can be traced to a specific publication that has become a persistent thorn in the administration's side. The Atlantic, of all publications, the outlet that has published devastating exposés on Donald Trump, his regime, Kash Patel, and numerous other figures within the administration's orbit, dropped a story that has fundamentally altered the internal dynamics of the White House. The Atlantic published an extensive exposé depicting the Trump regime in a state of advanced chaos, with factions warring against each other and the president increasingly disconnected from the machinery of his own government. Within this story, JD Vance was portrayed in terms that can only be described as heroic. The article presented Vance as the competent adult navigating a sea of incompetence, the one figure within the administration who understood what needed to be done and how to do it. The sourcing of this article is where the story becomes genuinely explosive. Numerous aides and advisors to JD Vance provided quotes for the piece, speaking either on background or in terms that allowed them to distance themselves from the published result, while still ensuring their perspectives were represented. The content was scathing in its treatment of everyone surrounding Donald Trump. The people around the president were described in terms that left little room for charitable interpretation. They were portrayed as horrible, as incompetent, as individuals who had no understanding of governance and no capacity for the responsibilities they had been given. Trump himself was depicted as a figure who did not know what he was doing, whose instincts were consistently wrong, and whose judgment could not be trusted. And positioned in direct contrast to this gallery of dysfunction was JD Vance, the man who had told everyone what needed to be done, the man who had provided the warnings that went unheeded, the man who had tried to steer the ship while the captain and crew insisted on steering it directly into the rocks. When the article appeared and the implications of its sourcing became clear, JD Vance was summoned to appear on the state regime media apparatus that styles itself as Fox News. The host, Will Cain, presented Vance with the opportunity to address the article directly, and Vance's response was precisely what one would expect from someone who understands the gravity of his predicament. He claimed ignorance of the sources. He insisted that the people quoted were not individuals associated with his team. He disclaimed any responsibility for the content of the article or the damaging narratives it advanced. But then he did something that made his denials impossible to take seriously. In the process of claiming that the story had not originated from his camp, he proceeded to confirm the essential accuracy of what the article described. The dynamic was unmistakable to anyone with experience reading political body language. Vance was attempting to distance himself from the leak while simultaneously validating the leaked information, a maneuver that satisfied no one and deepened the suspicion that he was the source of the damaging material. The sequence of cause and effect could not be clearer. The Atlantic publishes an expose that portrays Vance as the hero and everyone else in the administration as incompetent or malicious. The sourcing traces back to individuals within Vance's orbit. Vance offers denials that inadvertently confirm the story's substance. And then Donald Trump responds by publicly sidelining his vice president, removing him from a diplomatic assignment that should have been his by right, and elevating Marco Rubio into the position of prominence that Vance has now forfeited. The message from Trump is unambiguous. If you leak to the press, if you allow your people to paint you as the competent alternative to a failing president, if you position yourself as the solution to problems that the administration insists do not exist, you will pay a price measured in public humiliation and diminished standing. This was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a pattern of behavior that has been building for weeks. The accumulation of slights, missteps, and moments of perceived disloyalty has created a portrait of a vice president who forgot the first rule of survival in Donald Trump's orbit. Rule number 1 is that you never appear to be positioning yourself as the successor. You never allow the perception to take hold that you are waiting in the wings, ready to assume command when the current leader stumbles. You never create the impression that you believe yourself to be more competent, more capable, or more popular than the man who holds the office. JD Vance has violated this rule repeatedly, and each violation has been noted and filed away by a president whose memory for disloyalty is long and whose appetite for revenge is bottomless. Consider the incident that occurred roughly a week and a half before the Atlantic story broke. JD Vance appeared at a Turning Point USA event, one of those gatherings where the faithful assemble to reaffirm their commitment to the movement and its leaders. During his remarks, Vance addressed the subject of the Epstein files, and the way he framed his comments was impossible to misinterpret. He declared that he did not want people being involved in disgusting behavior. He emphasized that he did not want powerful people connected to the kind of conduct documented in the Epstein investigations. And then he added a knowing inflection that transformed a general statement into a pointed accusation. Hint, hint, he seemed to say, and everyone in the audience understood precisely who he was talking about. When the Vice President of the United States publicly hints that the president he serves may be implicated in the activities of Jeffrey Epstein, something has broken irreparably in the relationship between the two men. Trump certainly saw this clip. Trump certainly understood what Vance was insinuating. And Trump certainly added this transgression to the growing ledger of grievances that has now resulted in Vance's public humiliation. The pattern extends further back into the recent past. Everyone remembers the appearance JD Vance made made on Sean Hannity's program, the one where he addressed the question of presidential health and succession. Vance acknowledged that Donald Trump was healthy, offering the obligatory reassurance that the president remained fit for office. But then he added the comment that revealed his true thinking. If something were to happen to Trump, Vance said, he would be ready to step up. He would be prepared to assume the responsibilities of the presidency. The statement was framed in the conditional language of hypothetical concern, but the subtext was unmistakable. Vance was telling the audience that he had thought about succession. He had contemplated the scenario in which Trump was no longer president. He had positioned himself mentally as the person who would take command when the current leader departed the stage by whatever means. This is not the kind of thing a vice president says when he understands the precarious nature of his position. This is the kind of thing a vice president says when he has begun to believe his own mythology and forgotten who holds the power to destroy him. The Turning Point USA event provided yet another moment that must have infuriated the president watching from the White House. Vance used the platform to issue what amounted to a warning directed at Pope Leo XIV himself. He told the Pope to be careful about what he was saying regarding Catholicism. He told the pontiff, in terms that stopped just short of explicit threat, to watch his words and consider the consequences of his statements. The spectacle of the vice president publicly admonishing the leader of the world's largest Christian denomination was extraordinary enough on its own terms. But when combined with the chaos that erupted during the same appearance, the image of Vance that emerged was one of a man losing control. Members of the audience began shouting at Vance, calling him out alongside Donald Trump for what they characterized as genocide in Gaza. The protest disrupted the carefully staged event, and Vance's response was to begin yelling at the protesters directly, engaging in a public confrontation that revealed a man who was becoming unhinged under the pressure of his position. The footage of this moment circulated widely, and it cannot have escaped Trump's attention that his vice president appeared to be coming apart in public, while simultaneously issuing threats to religious leaders and hinting at presidential criminality. The Vatican dimension of this saga contains an even darker and more peculiar chapter that has fueled ongoing speculation within political circles. Many people have raised a question that sounds like the premise of a conspiracy thriller, but is being discussed with genuine seriousness. Did JD Vance kill the last pope? The timeline is undeniably strange, and the coincidences are difficult to dismiss. Vance met with Pope Francis, the predecessor to Leo XIV, in what was described as a demanding and insistent request for an audience. Pope Francis was visibly sick and frail at the time of the meeting. His health obviously compromised and his capacity diminished. Vance pressed for the meeting despite the Pope's condition, and the images of the encounter show a frail pontiff receiving a vice president whose demeanor appeared more demanding than deferential. And then, literally the next day, Pope Francis died. The sequence of events is established and undisputed. The implications that some have drawn from that sequence are naturally more speculative, but the fact that the question is being asked at all speaks to the strange and troubling aura that has come to surround JD Vance's interactions with the Vatican. Trump is surely aware of these whispers. Trump, who understands the power of insinuation and the damage that dark questions can inflict, has surely noted that his vice president is now associated in the public mind with the death of a pope. The mockery that Vance has endured from within his own movement adds another dimension to his current predicament. The right-wing podcast ecosystem, the constellation of influencers and commentators who play an outsized role in shaping MAGA world opinion, has settled on a characterization of Vance that is devastating in its simplicity. They have branded him a dork. They have labeled him one of the MAGA dorks, the socially awkward true believers who attach themselves to the movement without ever achieving the coolness or charisma that the movement's leaders project. Joe Rogan, whose platform reaches an audience that overlaps significantly with the Trump base, has explicitly called out the presence of these dorks within the movement, questioning why they need to be part of the coalition and expressing a desire to distance the movement's image from their awkward presence. When Vance was invited onto Benny Johnson's podcast and asked directly about Rogan's comments about being classified among the MAGA dorks that even allies want to exclude, his response was the response of a man who knows he cannot win the argument. The clip reveals a vice president who understands that he is being mocked by the very people whose approval he needs, and that there is nothing he can say that will change their perception of him. The Correspondents' Dinner incident introduced yet another element of suspicion into the relationship between Trump and Vance. When the chaos erupted at the Washington Hilton, when the alleged incident triggered the security response and the evacuation protocols, the Secret Service made a decision that has apparently lodged in Donald Trump's mind and festered there. They evacuated JD Vance first. They moved to secure the vice president before they moved to secure the president. The sequence of events is captured on footage that has been analyzed and reanalyzed. The Secret Service detail moves toward Vance and extracts him from the situation while Trump remains in place. Then Trump is seen stumbling, falling over himself as the evacuation proceeds. The question that has taken root in Trump's suspicious mind is impossible to dislodge once planted. Why did they take Vance first? Was Vance working with the Secret Service behind Trump's back? Had there been some arrangement, some understanding, some conspiracy that prioritized the vice president's safety over the president's? The logic of protective details does not work this way, and there are perfectly innocent explanations for why agents might move in a particular sequence during a chaotic and rapidly evolving situation. But Trump does not think in terms of innocent explanations. Trump thinks in terms of loyalty and betrayal, and the image of his own security detail appearing to value Vance's life above his own is the kind of image that haunts a man of his temperament. The electoral dimension of Vance's predicament compounds his problems. JD Vance is the least popular vice president in American history, a distinction that he holds while serving alongside the least popular president in American history. Donald Trump's approval ratings have descended to depths that surpass even Richard Nixon's standing at the moment of his resignation, a historical benchmark that was once thought to represent the floor of presidential unpopularity. Trump has crashed through that floor, and Vance has accompanied him into the basement of public esteem. The numbers tell a devastating story. Vance's favorability ratings are historically bad, worse than any vice president in the modern era of polling. The political liability that this represents is not theoretical. It is measurable, quantifiable, and increasingly impossible for the administration's strategists to ignore. While all of this has been consuming the vice president's standing, Marco Rubio has been engaged in activities that suggest a man without a care in the world. The footage of Rubio performing as a wedding DJ circulated at precisely the moment when the administration's foreign policy was absorbing another round of devastating setbacks. The Iran naval blockade, the signature initiative that was supposed to demonstrate American strength and bring the adversary to the negotiating table on terms favorable to Washington, has instead demonstrated the limits of American power. Iran continues to reject the framework that Trump describes as negotiations, but that objective observers recognize as demands for capitulation dressed in diplomatic costume. The blockade has failed to achieve its objectives. The adversary has not been brought to heel. And the Secretary of State is DJing weddings. The contrast between the gravity of the situation and the triviality of Rubio's chosen diversion is stark enough to be surreal. The assessment provided by Professor Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, one of the most respected scholars of international relations in the world, frames the strategic situation with bracing clarity. Iran won this war. Trump lost this war. The outcome is not ambiguous. The result is not subject to interpretation or spin. The naval blockade failed. The adversary prevailed. And now the political consequences of that failure are being distributed among the figures who will be held responsible for the defeat. Mearsheimer's analysis cuts to the heart of why Rubio and Vance are now engaged in this desperate competition to distance themselves from the negotiations with Iran. Neither of them wants to be associated with the process because they understand what the process has produced. America lost this war, and anyone who is seen as connected to the losing side will carry the stigma of defeat. The person who negotiates the concessions, the person whose name appears on the documents that formalize the retreat, will be viewed as a loser. And in the Darwinian ecosystem of Trump world politics, being viewed as a loser is a condition from which recovery is nearly impossible. So Rubio and Vance are both trying to avoid the assignment. They are both trying to ensure that the other one is left holding the bag when the music stops. The difference between them is that Rubio appears to be winning this competition, while Vance is being systematically stripped of his influence and his standing. The trajectory of this internal conflict points toward an outcome that will reshape the Republican landscape. Trump has sent an unmistakable signal about who he views as the future of the movement he controls. By elevating Rubio and humiliating Vance, by granting Rubio the high-profile diplomatic assignments while keeping Vance confined to Washington, by allowing the perception to solidify that Rubio's star is rising while Vance's is falling, Trump is effectively designating his preferred successor. This is not a formal endorsement. Trump does not operate through formal mechanisms, but in the informal language of power and favor that governs Trump world, the message is clear. Rubio is in, Vance is out. The vice president who positioned himself as the heir apparent, who allowed his people to portray him as the competent adult in a room full of children, who hinted at dark knowledge about his boss and publicly contemplated the scenario of succession, has discovered that the heir apparent role is filled at the pleasure of the king, and the king has decided that the presumptive heir has become too presumptuous to tolerate. The humiliation is designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. It punishes Vance for the leaks and the positioning and the subtle insubordination that have characterized his tenure. It warns other ambitious figures within the administration that the same fate awaits anyone who appears to be measuring the curtains in the Oval Office. And it creates a visible alternative in Marco Rubio, a figure whose loyalty has apparently been deemed sufficient to justify elevation. Whether Rubio understands that he is being used as a weapon against Vance, that his current favor is contingent on his continued usefulness in that role, is a question that will be answered in the months ahead. For now, the dynamic is locked in place. Trump has thrown Vance under the bus, and the wheels are still turning.